We're live.
Yay. Okay. Should I kick it off
I
then?
think you're kicking us off this month. Yeah.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Tipsy Ellipses, which is our monthly Facebook Live episode where our mothers like to show up and
They're
occasionally
not
do
here
it
yet.
together.
Come on, Mom. You're late.
I know what the heck. My mom probably has bridge tonight. So the first Tuesday of the month, we like to do a Facebook Live episode. It's a little looser and less structured than our typical episodes. As you can tell from the name, Tipsy Ellipses, there may be a little more cursing than usual. Probably will not take the time to bleep it out. And some of us have beverages. Some of us also, speaking for myself, so I did the half marathon last weekend, and you know how you go get the goodie bags?
My favorite part.
Yeah, you go the day before the race and you go get this little packet and it has your number and your T-shirt and, usually some free goodies or whatever.
Mhm.
They've kind of lowered throughout the years, but
Yes.
I noticed because my daughter who's 16 was running with me, and I noticed that mine had a pack of CBD gummies in
Oh
it.
gosh.
And I was like, I bet hers does
My
too. So sure enough, I was like, boop. And I took her. But I was like, and you know how I am. I am like, I watched too many after school specials in the 80s, and I am convinced I will be the one person who dies from a marijuana cigarette. Like,
This is your brain. This is your brain on
oh
drugs.
my God. No, it has worked. And so it really was like, well, if it came in the race pack, it has to be okay.
Oh, that's so great.
And so I was gonna use that for Tipsy Ellipses, and then I did use that for Tipsy Ellipses, and then while getting ready for dinner, I was like, "Oh god, it's the State of the Union tonight, and it's election results in Texas," and so I got a twofer going tonight. I got my free race pack CBD gummy with a little bit of Chardonnay to sploosh it off, so
Now that you're making running marathons sound a little more interesting.
Yeah, it comes with free drugs.
it does not usually come with free drugs. Usually it just
Right. Yeah.
actually, the best thing it ever came with, it was the first race we did 10 years ago when we moved here, and it came with a spy belt. Do you know what one of those is?
Oh, that's a good freebie.
I know, that's practically worth the price of admission, and we got
Yes.
it
It's
is
like a tiny little
Ooh,
thin belt that
yes.
you can wear while you're running, but it expands, and so it'll hold, like, your phone and a little bit of money and maybe a goo or, like, whatever you
Yes.
need. It looks tiny, but then it holds all this stuff.
Oh,
And
that's so interesting.
oh, it's my favorite. We'll have to put a picture of it up in the show
Yeah.
notes, and
I don't even run anymore, but I kept my spy belt.
oh, it's amazing, and you would think and they always say, "Don't add something new to your mix that you've never used before while you're training," but it was so handy that I was like, "Okay," day before the race 10 years ago, I decided to put it on and wear it for the race and wore it for 13 miles. Didn't even feel it. It's
Oh,
so and this is a little ad for Spy Belt. But I felt so bad because it was such a good goodie that they had a little, tent or a pop-up thing at the pickup this time, and, that thing has lasted forever, and it still is great, but now they have one that's just a little bit bigger,
Mhm.
and so I decided and my daughter was having me carry all her crap, and it was really testing the limits of the spy belt, so I decided to give her my old one, and now I got the bigger one for the mommy
Mm.
pack, so I upgraded myself. I decided I owed them after 10 years of using the same product that they have built to last, it will not die, so
Yeah, they're great.
I bought a new
that's
one.
so funny.
Yes, it's good for anybody. But anyway, that was a really long, tangent off of what Tipsy Lipsy is.
Yeah. Well, I think he kind of explained what Tipsy Ellipses is. So you wanna introduce yourself, Suzanne, and then I'll introduce
Oh,
myself,
sure,
and then
yes,
we'll get going.
okay.
Yeah.
To be in our standard mom and podcast form, I will introduce myself as I am Suzanne Kearns. I am a mom and writer, LGBTQ and sex ed advocate, and tonight I am an Amplify Austin Eve prepper. It's the day before Amplify Austin starts,
Mhm.
which is a big 2-day, not today, but 2 days, as in 1, 2, where all different nonprofits throughout the city. It's from 6 p.m. on March, it'll be 2nd, right? Through
Mhm.
6 p.m. March 3rd. People just donate like crazy,
Yeah.
and it's just a central location for people to get really excited and learn about a bunch of really amazing nonprofits in the
Yeah.
Austin area. And so, since I'm on the board of Carrying Hope and in charge of their newsletters, I've been working on that. And so, yeah, since everybody's probably, most people are probably gonna be listening to this after Amplify Austin has, you know, done its course, but you can still donate to Caring Hope or any of the other amazing organizations that you learn about through Amplify Austin. And you do not have to live in Austin to donate. So definitely go check out some of the amazing nonprofits doing cool stuff in our city.
Awesome. And I am Missy Stevens, mom and writer, foster care advocate, and today a voter. And I somehow, even though I am a very involved voter, completely forgot that it was State of the Union. In my mind, the only important thing happening tonight was Tipsy Ellipses. Earlier,
That's
my mom
it.
was like, "I don't know if I'm gonna watch the State of the Union or watch y'all." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" Like, what? Anyway, little embarrassing, but that's who
I
I
don't
am
think it
today.
starts until 8 though, right?
I think that's right. I think
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
So
Or else my
everybody pretty much
husband would
vote.
be up here, like, tapping his watch, being like, "Come on, come on."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I may have to get my glass of wine for that. So, and our guest, we're finally getting to our guest who's been so patient with us, is Amy Impellizzeri. She's a mom and reformed corporate litigator, one of our favorite kinds of people to talk to, a
Yes.
former startup exec, and an award-winning author of fiction and nonfiction. She has a new novel coming out in May of this year called In Her Defense. It's her sixth novel and her first in a new legal drama series.
I'm gonna bow to
Cannot
you a
wait.
little bit here.
Oh, cannot wait.
Yeah.
So, Amy is a tall poppy writer, a past president of the Women's Fiction Writers Association. Love to talk about that. And a 2018 writer in residence and a recipient of MSJD's Road Less Traveled Award. A faculty member in Drexel University's MFA in Creative Writing program, and she is frequently invited to speak at legal conferences and writing workshops and very prestigious events like Tipsy Ellipses. Welcome.
I
Thank
know.
you. Thank you
I
so
continue to be shocked with the, caliber of people who agree to come talk to us,
Yes.
and it shocks me.
Yes.
Shocks
It's
me
an
every time.
embarrassment of riches for sure.
I am honored. Thank you so much. And that was such a lovely introduction. Thank you.
Oh, well, we're so happy you could join us tonight. Thank you for taking the time. I know how busy you are.
It's my pleasure. Thanks.
We know a little bit of your story, but we would love for you to tell them about your pivot from being a
Yeah.
litigator to now being a full-time writer.
Yeah. So I just woke up one day and decided no. Um,
I was about to go,
Super easy decision.
so I was always going to be a lawyer. I was never going to be anything but a lawyer
interesting.
as a way to make a living. But I was always a writer. And I was always a writer as a little girl. I had, volumes and volumes of journals. I was always taking notes. I was always narrating the room when I walked in it. I was just always a writer, but I was always going to be a lawyer. And at some point, I decided that I couldn't do both. And I sort of do remember the exact moment that it happened. It was in college. I got what I thought was a bad grade on a paper. Lolita did me in, and literature. And I got like I remember it as a C minus. That's probably even being generous. And so I was like convinced that I couldn't write. And more than that, I was convinced that I couldn't go to law school, right? Because I was taking creative writing classes and free law classes, and I thought this was all going to come together in the end. And I was convinced that I was on the wrong path and I couldn't write and that I wasn't going to be a lawyer and that I wasn't going to get to law school. And a friend of mine who was a couple of years older, he was already in law school. He came back to visit for the weekend. And I was lamenting this to him. And he said, "Oh, Amy," he said, "you have to stop thinking that you can write in your own voice and still go to law school. Like that is a totally different kind of writing. If you go to law school, you're going to never write in your own voice. You're going to write in your client's voice. And trying to do the two things is like a mistake." And so instead of being horrified, I just was like, "Oh, okay." And I boxed up all my journals and I stopped taking creative writing classes. Just strictly went, pre-law, philosophy of law, and just said, "This is it. I can't do both." And so one has to go. And what went was my own voice. And
Oh,
that was my story for the next 20 years. I did go to law school and I was a practicing lawyer. I started out in Washington D.C. That's where I went to law school, and then I was clerking there for a couple of years. and then I moved to New York and I practiced for over 13 years. And can you hear my dog? My dog is
Yeah.
Only because I have an ear for dogs.
Yeah, I know. It's like, why are
crying, literally crying because I
Oh,
made him go upstairs. But
the nerve.
I know I'm hoping he just kind of settles down in a minute.
He's welcome down. We welcome all dogs.
Right now, I'm gonna
Last month we had a chicken
Yes,
on
last
Tipsy
month
Ellipses. Not just a chicken with a cold.
Oh, you know what? We
I
should
wonder
check
how the
with
chicken is.
Abby. I know I'm a little
Uh-huh.
concerned about how the chicken's recuperating from that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a good time to mention to everybody if you are enjoy the Tipsy Ellipses format, definitely go back to last month, which I believe was probably the loosest of our loose Tipsy
Right?
Ellipses.
And was anybody actually tipsy? I don't think
No,
so. Not
yeah, when Abby's oh my god.
I'm so glad he got to come to the show.
he's kind of loud. He's loud though. He's like
Oh
too
my
much. Okay,
god.
you're gonna love his name. His name is Don Vito. He's named for the Godfather.
Okay.
Oh,
I mean, doesn't he?
He really does. He's so cute.
okay. People need to go watch. If you're not watching on the Facebook Live, you need to go see. We have a YouTube channel where you can watch
Yes.
videos of all the podcasts. It's worth it. Even if
You
you
gotta
just
meet Don Vito.
yes, just
Yeah.
jump to minute 12 and go ahead and see this
I
adorable.
will. So, okay. So I'm sorry. So what I was saying was before Don Vito really interrupted me was that that was my story for the next 20 years. I did what I set out to do, which was become a lawyer. I practiced for over 13 years in New York, and I started out with I clerked, and then I went to work for a boutique litigation firm, and then eventually I moved into the city, into New York, and I worked for a big law firm, like one of the biggest, just the typical big New York City law firm, probably the biggest in the country. And so on paper, I had done like exactly what I set out to do, right? But
Mhm.
I was after a while, I always say I loved practicing law until I did, and so then I just
Yeah.
kind of I realized there was something going on. I couldn't figure it out after a while. Had 3 kids while I was practicing, and it got increasingly that made my life increasingly complicated each
Mhm.
time I had a child. Although
Don't do
I
that.
also say that having the kids kept me in law as long as it did, because every time I got burnout, I took a maternity leave. So
Aha.
every
How
couple of
long of a
years
maternity leave did you get?
3. I had 3 kids while I was practicing, and and they were 2 years apart, so I just kept leaving for, like, 6 or 7 months,
Oh,
and
okay, so that's a significant leave.
oh, yeah, I was it was no joke. I would save up all my vacation time, and that would take, like, a pretty substantial unpaid time,
Mhm.
and then I would go back to work, and then when I couldn't take it anymore,
Get pregnant?
So when you were on maternity leave, at the end of that, would you feel ready to go back to work?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I would. I remember I had a friend who said to me the first time after my first child was born, and it was always a given that I was going to go back. At the time, I'm not married any longer, but at the time I was, and I put my ex-husband through medical school and medical training. And so there was really never any doubt that I was going to, as a practical matter, that I was going to go back to work. But as the date got closer for me to go back to work, I was looking forward to it. Like I said, I loved being a lawyer until I didn't. And I loved, oh, a car just went by.
That's a good bark for a little
I know.
dog.
And I remember I had a friend who said to me, I said, I'm looking forward to going back, but it's a weird feeling to be leaving. Like the first time I left, it was like a weird feeling to be leaving my baby.
Yeah.
And I remember I had a friend say, and she was a stay at home mom, and she said, you now get to do something I'm really jealous about. You get to miss your child. And she's like, and that is a really big deal. She's like, because she's like, I never get to miss my kids. And she loved being at home and she loved.
Course.
And I thought, what interesting perspective, right?
You just took the words right out of my mouth. I was just about to say that. What a
Yeah, this
beautiful
is like
perspective.
Suzanne and I both stayed home for a long time, and technically we're still home, I guess. But I remember thinking, wow, like I would love to be away from you for a little while. I didn't put it in terms of, like, what a novel experience to miss my
Yeah.
kids, but,
Mhm.
like, you don't miss them
No,
when you're with them all the time.
you never miss them.
No,
Right.
no. Only when I had the newest of newborns, like, he was brand new,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
I can remember, like, night 2 or something
Yeah.
at home telling Mark, like, "I miss him while I'm sleeping." Mark was like,
Oh,
"What are you
oh,
even talking about?" Because Mark, of course, was like but that was it. Like, after that,
yeah.
you were get
I'm
over to the
taking Mark's side on that one. I was like, "No."
yeah, yeah. Can't explain it. Like, oh,
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So I'm curious, did that get easier than with baby 2 and 3?
So no, it didn't. So, when I
Um,
went back the first time, it made sense and I never had a live-in, but I had a really wonderful babysitter. So I did carve out, see at the time. So it was it sounds like I'm gonna tell you this was happening in like 1940, but it was 2003. There was really no formal maternity leave policy at my
oh,
gigantic mega law firm. I mean,
yeah, I believe you.
it was
2005
really
my first. Mhm.
loose, and I basically negotiated a schedule so that I could be home 2 days. Like, well, in the office 3 days, home 2 days, but also working like, weekends, and that was part-time, but it was strictly on the down low. Nobody was to know. It's
Uh,
very hush hush. I'd go in for reviews and the partner would say, "You're doing a great job." Nobody would know you have kids. Like, I didn't keep pictures of my kids in my office. I'd leave a coat on the back of my chair at all times so it looked like I was there if I had to leave or anything. Like, if a kid had an earache, I would tell them that I got hit by a car before I would say I was home with a sick kid. Like, there was
oh
no
my god.
way I would ever say I was home with a sick kid. So, that said, I did
Yeah.
that for a little while, and then I said, you know, this is this is crazy, right? But I and then I had another baby, and I was still kind of like juggling it okay. I was sort of like I feel like I figured this out. And so much so, in fact, that after I had my second, I was like, look at me being arrogant. I kind of have this down. I think I'll have a third. And, at the time, and I had two boys. My first two babies were boys. And, my husband at the time was like, I mean, he was in medical training. He used to say, pretend I don't live here. Like, pretend I'm not here. To go back, maybe I'll show up every once in a while.
like,
Yeah.
eventually, that is exactly what I did.
Yeah, that's what I did. Not married anymore. But then I thought, well, I have this. I have this down. I'm doing this on my own. I don't need, I had a babysitter. Did have help, but I didn't have any family around. But I was kind of like navigating and I was like, let's have a third. I really want to have a third. And he said to me, this really can't be about having a girl because, you just never know. And I was like, no, it's not. I feel like I'm not done. And he was like, I really don't know if I want to have another baby. And I'm like, but if we have another baby, you'll never regret that. And if I don't have another baby, I may regret that. So it
Yeah.
feels like this is the way it's got to go. And we were still having that conversation when I got pregnant. So, and so there I was having my third baby and like, yeah, I totally have this. And oh boy, when I had my third, and I did have a little girl, but I always say like I didn't have her name's Grace, so I would say when people would be like, "Oh, you finally got your girl," I'm like, "Well, I actually got my Grace." Like that's what it was about. But
Oh.
I I did feel done. Like I did feel done then after Grace was born in a way I did not feel after the boys were born. But
3 babies will do that to you.
Turns out I am done.
more than 2 children, and I also, by that point, I was working, like, 4 days in the office, 3 days at home, and it was a lot, and I was really not juggling it very well, and I started putting out into the universe. I didn't really know a way to not do it, though, because my then husband was still in his medical training. He was in his residency at the time, and we were living in New York. We had lived in New York. We still had our house in New York. He was doing his actually his fellowship, and then he was doing his fellowship in North Jersey, and we were renting a house in North Jersey. We had kept our house in New York. Like
Oh,
we had
wow.
we there were financially, we were stretched to our limits.
Wow.
And there was no ability for me to leave at that point. But I kept kind of putting it out in the universe, like, I really don't know what I'm gonna do. How am I gonna do this? And lo and behold, Lehman Brothers collapsed. And when Lehman Brothers collapsed, ironically, a lot of the law firms in New York City started laying off, and Skadden decided not to lay off any lawyers. They instead started this program called Sidebar Plus. And so they offered it out to all of the lawyers, and you could apply for it, basically a 1 year subsidized, partially subsidized sabbatical. And
Mm.
so I, so here's what happened. All the litigators, so I was a litigator, and the litigators, we were still busy. We still, totally impervious to economic decline. But the M&A lawyers were sitting around kind of worrying about their jobs. So
What
what
does M&A stand for?
Oh, sorry, mergers and acquisitions. So
Okay, thank
working on the big
you.
corporate deals had no corporate deals to work on,
Oh,
right?
got it, got it.
But anybody who was working on lawsuits, those are still
They
fine,
yes,
Those
fine.
never stop. Yeah.
Those never stop. And
they're very inelastic. Or is that right? Elastic they're inelastic.
yeah, yeah, that's good. I like that. So what happened was all the litigators started applying for the sabbatical, and all the corporate attorneys were like, well, now we're not going to lose our job, and we still don't have any work to do. This is we're going to stay right where we are. And all the litigators were like, no, send us on sabbatical. And so at first, the head of my department was like, I was like, oh, this is great. I'm going to apply for a sabbatical. And at first, the head of my department was like, oh, no, you're a litigator. You're way too busy. You can't leave. And I was like, "Oh my goodness, but you said anybody could apply." And they were like, "Oh, not you." So then I said, "Well, why don't you move some of the not just me, but other litigators who wanted to take a sabbatical were like, why don't you move some of the corporate lawyers into our spots and let us leave since they don't seem to want to take a sabbatical?" And that's what they ended up doing. So they
Oh,
ended up
wow.
restructuring a little bit. And I have this funny story about how we went to a luncheon right before we left. Like a bunch of us who were going on the sabbatical, we went on this luncheon, and this will just tell you the kind of the environment I was working in. One of the partners, we were all sort of like, what are, we were leaving to do various things. I said that I was going to leave to write, which was again going to be the first time I was going to be reclaiming like my voice in 20 years.
Mm.
And other people were doing all kinds of things. Somebody was going to start a bar. Somebody was going to, help a friend open a bar and travel and do different things.
Yeah.
And we were all like, what are we gonna, are we even gonna come back at the end of the year? I guess so. What else can we do? And one of the partners stood up and said, oh, you will definitely be back. And here's why. You will find when you leave here that the most interesting, accomplished, wonderful people you're ever going to meet in your life are here in this building. So you are definitely going to come back here. And I remember thinking, is that true?
That'd be
Is
right.
this as good as it gets?
Gosh. And I remember I went back down to my office, and a colleague, a friend of mine who I thought really, and still do think really highly of, he came by and he was like, how was lunch? He wasn't taking the sabbatical, right? And he was like, how's lunch? And I'm like, well, listen to what the partner said. And I told him this like toast, that he had said. And he said to me, my friend, who I thought, was like a relatively rational, reasonable person, said, well, that's probably true, don't you think? And I remember thinking, everyone here is drinking this Kool-Aid. Like, I
Yeah.
have to get out of here
Mhm.
before I start drinking the Kool-Aid too.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so that started my sabbatical. But I call that year was a very pivotal year for me. I call that the year of me because I didn't do anything that year. I was very intentional that year. I knew it felt very finite. It felt very limited. It felt like a grand opportunity that the universe
Yeah.
had given me. I did not want to squander 1 minute of it. So I didn't read books I didn't want to read. I didn't finish meals I didn't like. I didn't do anything that wasn't going to further the goal of figuring out where I was going to be at the end of the year. And so I did a lot of different things. I said yes a lot. And I
Yeah.
got in on board meetings, and I did advocacy work, and I did pro bono work, and I started doing writing for some different magazines. And I met a woman who was an editor of a magazine who was leaving to basically work with a startup company, and I just started doing freelance writing for her because I kept saying yes to things.
Mm.
And I met this woman who was going to work for the startup company and basically taking like a print magazine online. That's what the
Mm.
startup company was doing. And it was called Hybrid Her, and it was telling the stories, helping market and telling stories of women entrepreneurs. And I was just started out just doing freelance writing, but I would basically ask, like, anytime there was gonna be a board meeting or a meeting with the it was a venture capital funded company, which I didn't even know what that meant at that point, right?
Right.
But I would just ask to sit in on stuff, I would be like, "Oh, there's a meeting with can I sit in on that?" "Sure, sure, sure." And then, if there was any grunt work to be done, I would volunteer to do it. And I was just constantly insinuating myself into places. And then finally, by the end of the year, there was a job, and it was, you know, very little money,
Yeah.
and it was not legal. And that was what was funny, is that they had their own legal team. The venture capital fund company already had, their legal team. And then the creative team at the startup company would say to me, every time we ask the lawyers for anything, they tell us no. Can you tell us like what we're doing wrong? And I'd say, well, yeah, you're asking for this and you have to ask for that. And I started to realize, like, oh, I'm like a translator between the creative team
Yeah.
and the legal team, which is something I never understood I could do. Right. And I started understanding, oh, wait a minute, because it's not that I'm leaving the law behind. Because I'm a lawyer, there's actually a whole world of things I can do that have nothing to do
Mhm.
with working for a law firm. That was the first time I understood that. And it's funny, like at the end of the year, there was a job. And so what I did was I told the law firm I wasn't going to come back. I asked him if I could turn my 1 year sabbatical into a leave of absence. So we just basically extended because I was too, lawyers are very risk averse, right? So I was still kind of like worried about just jumping ship. And so, but I took this job that was like even less than the subsidized, my sabbatical was already subsidized with a fraction of my salary. And then I took this job that was even less than the subsidized,
Mhm.
sabbatical, just on like, basically a hope and like a dream that it would turn into something more. It did. It was funny, within the next year, I negotiated for myself a position on the executive board. There was a couple of VP positions, and I negotiated a VP position. And I actually I started writing about it probably, halfway into the sabbatical. I got this idea for a novel that was about, not surprisingly, a woman who was at this crossroads in her life and was sort of reevaluating decisions she had made that took her in a certain direction. And I imagined it in the context of a love story, which was not how I was experiencing it at that time.
Right.
It was very much a not love story. But I started writing that on the side of working for the startup company, and you know working with these women entrepreneurs who were pursuing all sorts of creative ventures was unlocking something for me. It was unlocking some kind of creativity for me.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's gotta be such a cool energy
Yeah.
to be around.
And
Oh,
some of them were lawyers
yeah.
who had left the
We
law.
hear that so
Yes.
much. How
I
many
can
of
tell
our
you
favorite
how many
writers
reformed lawyers
Yeah.
we talk to.
I mean,
And that was the other thing that started to become really interesting to me. I started to think, because I used to think my law firm was in the same building as the Condé Nast offices. So all the Vogue and
oh, see,
all
all the
those.
energies are just mingling.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I can remember very distinctly standing back and like walking into the building and watching the seas part. And you could see very clearly the lawyers going in one side and the beautiful people going in the other side. And I would think to myself, like, I
Ah,
really want to be on that side. It's a very visual, interesting
that
split.
is
And
so
and in my
interesting.
mind, I thought to myself, it is one or the other. You're either creative or you're a lawyer. But I have come to understand that the law actually attracts very creative people,
Oh,
and have
so creative.
no outlet for that creativity. The practice of law, the world of law firm and
Mhm.
big law. Um, Actually, the happiest lawyers I know are solo practitioners and lawyers who have their own firms
Mm,
because they can exercise that creativity.
yeah.
But when you work for a law firm the way I did, just there's no outlet for that creativity whatsoever.
Mhm. Well, I wanna talk so much about your books too, but, there's just so many things going ding, ding, ding as you're
Oh,
talking about
sorry.
this. But no, first of all, the idea of that there was no, back in you said 2003, and,
Yeah,
for me, it was 2005. There was
me
just
too.
no policy or structure or anything around this, and we've got an episode coming up, oh my gosh, it's not gonna be until the middle of March, but with Amy Beacom and Sue Campbell, who wrote a book called The Parental Leave Workbook, and
Oh,
what's the name of the group that's
playbook.
the Amy runs? It's called, like, the Center for Parental Leave, I believe.
Yeah.
And that is their gig. They want to basically have every company have part of the HR team be this doula, basically,
Uh,
that helps you from the second that you got 2 lines on the stick to be able to kinda work you through emotionally, career-wise, and just be with you that whole way. And, as you do go on maternity leave, whether it's 3 months, 3 weeks, 9 months, be able to kinda be your touch base through that, deciding where you're at mentally, if you wanna come back to that job, and I just think, what a gift to be able
yeah,
to do that and not be in the position that the 3 of us were. But then the
yes.
other thing I was thinking of, the reason I'm trying to figure out, like, why your one-year sabbatical was so successfully, like, a one-year sabbatical and not like a 16-year leave of absence like me and Missy. And I keep going back to, we had a great interview with Lisa Stromberg for Work Pause Thrive was her book. And what was her statistic, Missy? I'm gonna probably mess it up. It was basically like, of the women who took these career pauses, like 70 something percent of them had no regrets.
Ah,
Right. Yeah.
And which I found
Yeah.
like, "Whoa, that was just such a breakthrough statistic for me." But it was also the women who had the shorter breaks, so like a year instead of
yes,
16 years, and then also had some type of strategy around it or kept themselves engaged during it, which sounds like so much what you did. So you were off
That
for a year.
intentionality. I really got hung up on the word intentional with
Yeah,
that.
it
Yeah.
was so intentional.
Yeah.
You were saying yes to so many
yes,
things. And I think that, because day one of my break, I had a major identity crisis and like was just all my self-worth and my accomplishments went in the garbage. And I was like,
yeah,
okay, starting from square one, apparently I'm this new person.
yeah.
Whereas I think if you go into it with that intentionality, did you suffer from any identity crisis or you just thought you were still awesome and just taking this break and trying some stuff out?
Yeah, it was totally fine. There were no dark moments whatsoever. No, of yeah, of course I did. I did, but I will say that they were not as intense as I would have thought. And I do think that I because I sort of shifted my identity, right? And I did still for a long time I did still call myself a lawyer, or I would say, well, I'm a lawyer who now, works for this company. And so even though I wasn't working as a lawyer for them, right?
Mhm.
But I would, and sometimes, I'd be in meetings and people would say, well, Amy, you're a lawyer. And they'd not ask for my legal opinion, but there was a certain like shorthand
Yeah.
about making sure that people in the room knew that I was still a lawyer. And so I think that because I did hold on to that identity in sort of like a adjacent way,
Mhm.
um, and I did within a couple of years, I was working on my novel and I was starting to sort of like transition out of this idea that I was a lawyer and sort of like, well,
Mm.
what is this going to look like next? And what is my next chapter going to look like? And I got a call from an agent who was working with the American Bar Association. And she said, she said, I was writing some articles in addition to all the other things I was saying yes to. I would write articles for different legal magazines about taking the sabbatical and about the intentionality of the sabbatical. And she said, I've been reading what you've written. And she said, I've been trying to pitch this book to the ABA for a while about leaving the law, like this book called Lawyer Interrupted, but they haven't really been on board for it. She said, but I think that there'd be a real market for this book.
Mm.
And I feel like you'd be the one to write it. And I said, well, I'm sitting here with this novel. Like, this is the book that that I thought I was going to be trying to sell. But now you're kind of convincing me about a book that I probably should write.
Mhm.
And so so I said, yeah, again, I just said yes to so many things. And I said, yeah, let's do this book proposal together. So we pitched a book to the ABA called Lawyer Interrupted, and that book was sold before. That was my first book deal. So that book actually helped me get my novel deal.
Yeah.
But when I did that, when I worked on that pitch of like, these are the things you can do with your law degree that don't involve practicing law. I was
Mhm.
able to sort of reframe, okay, this isn't something I threw away. This isn't something because I struggled with that. And to be honest with you, people very close in my life,
Mhm.
like my ex-husband, said things to me like, this is a waste. Like you're throwing a
Mhm.
career away.
Mhm.
And you practiced for 20 years.
I practiced for 15 years.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, we talked to so many who are like 6 months out of law
Yeah.
school. They're like, "Nope, that was a bad decision." I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked to people who even sooner, like in law school, realized
yeah,
this is probably not for
yeah.
me.
And I'm
Yeah.
not saying that you have to practice law for a certain amount of time to
Right.
justify it. I'm just saying
Right.
that for, there's so many stories that, are a much shorter amount of time that are
Right.
still just as justified in making a pivot.
But here's the interesting thing, right? Even though I practiced for 15 years, people still would say to me 2, 3 years down, after my after my sabbatical, "Don't you miss it? Don't you wanna go back?" I mean, it's really like it's something that didn't matter how long I had practiced. People still couldn't believe that I would walk away from it.
Mm.
And so there were chinks in the armor when that would happen,
Yeah.
you know? And I would but and like each time I'd have to kind of like like look inside and say like, am I okay with this? Am I okay with this decision?
Yeah.
Was this an okay decision? And frankly, every time someone would ask me that question, it just helped me reframe it just helped me focus on my answer. It just helped me really kind of like reclaim the reasons why I was still not practicing law, which
Yeah.
I already did it. And now it's time
I
for a
did it.
different chapter. Yeah. So
Oh,
I'm always stunned by we hear it from a lot of our guests that out people outside of ourselves have very strong opinions about what we should be doing. And
yeah.
really, we
so
are the only
bizarre.
ones who can assess what are our values? What is it that we want? Who are we? Where
Yeah.
are we going? Only we know that.
Yeah.
And only those really close to us who really love us and are willing to understand that
Yeah.
like that's who gets it. And
Yeah.
it blows my mind when
Yeah.
people kind of out here are just like, "What are you doing and why are you doing it?" Well, I am. And what does it matter to you?
Yeah. And the corollary to that, of course, is that if you are trying to do things to please those people or to have a certain answer, a different answer that's not authentic for those people, then you just you're going backwards
Yeah,
because
miserable.
yeah, it's just not going to work. And I didn't go to law school or really embark on my legal career for anybody else other than me.
Mm.
And so I didn't leave for anybody other than me either. I tell my kids too, like I didn't leave the law to be home with you guys. I mean, I really like I left the law so that I could figure out what my next chapter was so that I'd be a better example to you than someone who was by that point unhappy. Um
Right.
so yeah, so
Ken, I think it's really legitimate that you weren't happy in it in that point. Like, though sometimes we are not happy, and it doesn't negate the 15 years before that, and it certainly doesn't mean where you go forward is wrong. Like, it's okay to
yeah,
change.
And
yeah.
it
Change.
definitely seems to have gotten you to a place you were happy while you were doing it until you weren't happy. And
Yeah,
so you did though then start this new chapter. So let's start talking about
yeah.
the actual books. Let's
I started writing, like I said, I was writing this novel for years and years and years. And then, I took the sabbatical in 2009 through 2010. And that's when I started writing the book. And it was probably like 2013 or 2014 when I got the call about Lawyer Interrupted. And I was, years into writing this novel by then. And also didn't really know what I was going to do with it. I really had no
Yeah.
idea. Like, what do I do? Like, do I like take it to Staples and put a binding on it and give it as Christmas gifts. Like, I don't like, what do I do at this point? Right.
A lot of people do.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, so and then what happened was I actually I started going to writing conferences, I started working on the craft because I figured out pretty early on that, oh, just because I'm a lawyer and used to write for a living doesn't mean that translates over to writing a book, right? So back to the old idea of like reclaiming my own voice, understanding that like writing in my own voice was something very different than the legal writing I had done. And then I had to sort of figure that out. I had to figure out how to plot a novel, how to, I just had to figure all that out. So I started going to writing conferences and I started talking with I met other writers. And like I said, I was in the startup world. I was meeting all sorts of creatives. The head of the startup company, she had been a magazine editor. So she,
Mm.
said to me, if you ever finish that novel of yours, I started saying it out loud. I kept it secret
Oh,
for a long time. I started saying it out loud, like I'm working on a book.
That's a big step.
Yeah, it
big
was a
step.
big step. And I told
Speaking from experience, once you tell people, then they're like, "Well, where is it?"
I remember actually some of the first people I told were I told my sisters, and then I told my own book. I was in a book club and I told my own book club. And then it was like the time was ticking then. It was like,
Mm.
when are you going to finish your book? Right. And so then I met this writer who at the time was just kind of breaking out. And now she's very, very successful. Her name's Sarah Pekkanen. And we were in touch online and she said to me, "Oh, I'm running a workshop in DC and it's not about the craft of writing," which I was already going to like a lot of those kinds of conferences. She said, "This is about the business of writing." And I was like, "Oh, that's very interesting because I know nothing about the business of writing." And she said, "Yeah, you should come." So I went to this one day conference and it was so fascinating. It was a huge turning point in my journey because I was in a room with people who were all different level. Some people had numerous manuscripts, some people had like a notebook of ideas, and I had basically a manuscript that was almost done. And we went around the room at the end and said like what we were going to do as a result of the day. And I said, "I'm going to finish this manuscript." And she said, "Okay." She said, "Well, if you do that, I will read the beginning and I'll give you my honest feedback." And so that was like really, that was really a ticking clock at that point, right?
Yeah.
Because
Mm.
then I thought I have to do this before she forgets she said that. Oh, yeah. And so I went home and I finished the manuscript and I sent it to her, her the beginning. I said, reminded her that she had said she would look at it and she did. And she said, "Yeah, this is a real book. You have a real book here." And she made some introductions for me as a result. And again, saying it out loud, taking a risk.
Mhm.
And she introduced me to her agent, who didn't end up becoming my agent, but it was just the first step of learning the business and learning how to sort of navigate the world of publishing, which is a very different world than the art of writing. It's like the art and business, right? So yeah, that was a huge milestone for me in the journey. Eventually, I did get a book deal for both the nonfiction book and the fiction book, and I left the startup company when that happened because then I had to write a book. The nonfiction book was sold only in the pitch, so I had to
Yeah,
actually
right.
write the book.
Yes.
And yeah, so that started my journey of writing and writing for a living. But I will say, and I say this all the time with full transparency, I've never replicated my salary from practicing law. Like
Mm.
I've never replaced that, but I've never minded and I've never regretted. It's a totally different, it's just been a total, I did a lot of things. We moved out of New York, we moved to Pennsylvania to have like a lower cost of living.
Mhm.
I don't have a babysitter. I didn't have a babysitter anymore. And I also talk a lot about, I tell transitioning lawyers this, but also other transitioning professionals too, who are like, "I can't leave because I have to make a certain amount of money and I'm tied to the salary." And I tell people this a lot. When you're doing work you don't love, there's a whole category of expenses that falls away when you leave, which I call
Oh.
self-soothing expenses, like those like dinners out and clothes and stuff that you just don't need, but you
Mm.
buy to justify the money that you're making in a job you hate.
Yes.
I love that term, self-soothing
Yeah,
expenses.
and it's a whole category of expenses that falls away, and so that was one of the first things that I did when I took the sabbatical and when I ended up with the startup company, and I told you like that first job offer was like a fraction of the money I had been making. But what I did was instead of especially when you're a lawyer and you're working on billable hours, you have this whole idea of what you're worth and like you're worth this amount of money.
Yep.
Right. So it's so confusing.
Oh,
It messes
so
with your
when
head.
yeah, once you know a figure that you get billed for,
Yeah.
it just messes.
So then you have this idea like, oh, I can't work for less than I'm worth. But what I was able to figure out pretty early on that what I really needed to figure out was how much money I needed to make and not how much money I thought I was worth. And so I came up with a number, and I tell lawyers, transitioning professionals this all the time. Don't try to come up with your number that you think you're worth. Come up with your number that you need because and it can have a cushion and it can have whatever. But come up with that number and start there because you may find that many more possibilities are open to you that are really wonderful. And like I said, I'm very transparent about the fact that I never made big law salary. I still haven't made big law money again, even in publishing. But I've never, like I said, I've never regretted it and I've never minded.
Yeah, I think that you have the passion to write. You're not doing
Yeah.
it for the money. And especially once you learn a little bit about the business,
Yes.
you know you're not gonna do it for the money. I mean,
No, people do not. That's the thing. Like writing is not. I do have a lot of lawyers. I do a lot of legal conferences, and no matter what I'm doing, they always say,
No matter what I do, they say,
whatever. They always say, like, no matter what topic is, there's always like, please add on a topic about writing a book. Like, there's always a room full of lawyers who want to write a book, right? And then they'll always say to me, like, oh, I want to leave the law. I want to quit my job and write a book. And I'm like, please do quit your job to write a book. Like that's number one. Don't do that. It's a very bad idea to ever quit your job to write a book. But
unless you're John Grisham who happens
yeah, exactly. It's not an easy way to make a living at all.
No.
But you can figure out, like the secret formula is if you can figure out what is the thing you would do even if it didn't make you any money, and then figure out a way to make money doing it, right? But if you
Uh-huh.
can figure out what's the thing you would do even if you couldn't make any money doing it, that's the secret to happiness, right? So like if I would write even if I wasn't getting paid for it. But then you figure out a way to monetize it, and that's the magic formula, right?
Yeah.
So I would not practice law for free. We've
Right.
got to that.
yeah.
Right?
Right.
But it's just
Yeah, I would never go back to my corporate life for free, but I would podcast probably for the rest of my life.
I
Dang it.
know. I
We may be,
know.
Suzanne, we may be doing this for free. We haven't
We gotta find a way to make our millions doing this.
Yeah.
we're even just our
Right.
hosting fees.
Saying that you can't make money doing those things, right.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. We've talked about it. Like, we will keep doing this because it fulfills so much and it's so fun to meet people and,
Yeah.
Ah,
it's just a piece of who we are, but it's so much fun.
And you never know what doors it's gonna open. You
yeah.
never know what doors these kinds of things will open, and those
Absolutely.
and that was my intentional year, right? I learned about opening doors, and I learned that, thank goodness, the most interesting, most wonderful people I was ever gonna meet were not at the law firm.
I was gonna ask. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the big question. Like, were those the most fascinating,
No.
interesting people?
No, no.
But and we joke a lot about the lawyers who become writers just because we know so many
I
of
know a lot of
them.
them. Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking,
KJ?
well, there's KJ. We got Amanda. You and Amanda
Yeah.
have got to meet.
Yeah,
Yeah, I feel like we need to hook up with some friends there. But it's not just necessarily even lawyers. I'm so excited because we've got an episode coming this week with Alicia Fernandez Miranda. And by time this airs, it was probably yesterday's episode. We're doing some time traveling again.
Always.
got it.
So confusing.
Who just started a podcast this week called Quit Your Day Job. where she's interviewing just all kinds of interesting people with jobs. So it's just kind of
I
a little
love that.
peek. It's like doing a little mini internship just for, in your
Yeah.
ears while you listen to the
That's exactly.
podcast.
Oh, I love that so much.
But she has a book coming out next year called The 40-Year-Old Intern, where she just went and tried for,
Ah,
I think it was like 5 or 6 different jobs that
Yeah,
she
I
thought
think
when
so.
she was little would be her dream jobs to
yes, yes,
determine,
yes,
like,
yes.
what they were really like. And so I just love this whole idea. It's kind of the sliding doors mentality
Yes.
or, or the pivot mentality. I mean, just
Yeah.
however you go about doing it, allow yourself to
Yes.
get a little creative and think about some alternate lives for yourself.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean you have to quit that job. Like you said, you're just saying,
Right.
don't quit automatically.
So
You
that's
don't have to
exactly
blow
right.
it
I
up.
tell people a lot, like the do it on the side method is like the best way to
Legitimate.
explore a potential pivot. Absolutely.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, my husband has written 5 plus books,
Yeah.
more
It's
maybe,
prolific.
in just being really intentional and being really
Love it.
strategic and tactile about having. I mean, he's just so disciplined about setting that time aside to write, and it's shocking what you can do 1 hour at a time over the course of a year, and you don't have to blow it all up to be able to do that. It's, to
Yeah.
Yeah.
try it in bits and pieces instead of in entire chunks, if that's
Right.
something that you wanna try out, so.
Oh, we're getting close to an hour, and I really want to respect your time and the time of anybody who happens to be watching because there is a lot going on in the world, and people probably need to run to their TVs or their families or bed. Before we go, tell everybody about your new book, In Her Defense.
In her defense, so it's funny. So now here we are over 10 years post sabbatical. And when I was first publishing and when I would go to book events or book clubs, I was not writing legal fiction, legal drama. And there would always be like a disgruntled lawyer character in one of my books. But
Yeah.
other than that, there was no real recognition that I had been a practicing
Right.
lawyer. And people would say to me, "Why don't you write legal drama? Why don't you write legal thriller?" And I would always say, like, well, the kind of law I practiced was not very sexy, right? It was corporate law. It wasn't really like the John Grisham style of law, and it wasn't really the stuff of legal novels. But the real reason was I was just way too close to it. I was
Mhm.
just really trying to separate from that world. And there was a little bit of defiance, I think, like I will
Yeah.
not write about that. And so now here we are, 10 plus years post sabbatical. And I decided that I got this idea to write a series about a town, a fictional town in which, whereas some towns are known for like uh, you know, their bio or pharmaceutical industry or their, beautiful landscape, this town's known for its lawyers. And it's got the River's Edge Law Club, which is like the center of the town. And it's, like a country club, but not really. It's basically a place where all the lawyers come and it's a commuter town to Manhattan. And so it's a place where all the lawyers sort of make their deals and have all their backdoor
Mm. Mhm.
deals secrets. And I had this idea that I wanted to write courtroom drama and I wanted to write legal drama. And so we my agent was very supportive and we pitched it starting as 2 books right now. So the River's Edge Law Club series is being published by Wyatt Mackenzie, who's been my fiction publisher since the beginning. And the first book is coming out this May, and then the second book will come out in the spring. And I mean, in the spring of 2023.
Okay. That's so
So
exciting.
yeah, and so the first book of River's Edge Law Club is called In Her Defense, and it's about a woman who has left the law. She used to be a lawyer, and she left the law, and ironically, I did this before. She's now a podcast host, and when I started writing this book, I did not have my own podcast. I
You manifested it.
wanted to
Yeah.
do it, I manifested it. Yeah, so at this point,
You did.
this book is not about me, right? But this woman is a former lawyer who is now a nationally recognized podcast host. And her podcast is about decluttering. And she's really all about appearances and perfection and a
Mm.
facade, right?
Mhm.
And her husband, she's got, kind of a rocky marriage, and her husband ends up dead. And the prime suspect is his mistress. And also turns out to be a former friend of the lawyer, the former
Oh.
lawyer. And so the prime suspect, who is her former friend, calls her. She's her one call from jail. And she says, I need you to represent me. I'm calling in a favor. And so you don't really know what the favor is, right? But she's calling in a favor. And she decides to go back to the law for one case only to represent her former friend who is accused of killing her husband. And
What?
the lawyer's husband. And so obviously there's some secrets between the two of them and there's some,
Yeah.
some things going on. And that's what it's about. It's really about these two women and sort of their relationship and also their individual histories that have led them to this point. And so I'm really excited about it. And so the way the series is going to work is that each book is going to involve a different set of characters, but in each story that there'll be a character that will basically emerge, to the characters will hand the story off to another character, right?
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. So in book one, it's part courtroom drama, it's part psychological suspense. And then the law clerk that handles the trial, the murder trial, she becomes the main character in the second book. And there's a little excerpt of the second book in this one. So yeah, I'm very excited about it. And like I said, I do feel like the post traumatic stress disorder of practicing law has worn up enough to really to write.
Yes.
Really fun. It was fun to revisit. Even though I didn't practice criminal law, I was a trial lawyer, and so it was
Yeah.
fun to revisit that, and it was fun to go back to that world in a very safe way.
Yeah.
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 Oh, well, pre-order it now, people. I'm
Yeah.
going to pre-order it.
No, if you need any advanced readers.
Yeah. Yes, yes, I do. I do for sure. So we'll talk about that.
Yeah, I would love to read it. It's right in my wheelhouse of
Oh
what I
my
love
god,
to
that
read.
sounds so
Good.
cool. Oh my gosh. Well, that is so exciting. And then, of course, that you've written other books too.
Yeah. 5
Yeah.
other fiction books?
So in her defense, so the new series is in her defense, my sixth novel. Which is funny because and then I say like the first 5 novels, right, were not legal thrillers, but I do feel like they were all very different, except my first novel, Lemongrass Hope, and then my most recent novel, I Know How This Ends. They are sort of bookends and they're related. So I Know How This Ends is sort of like we call it a paraquel, not really a sequel. It kind of runs alongside Lemongrass Hope. And the other books in between those 2 are totally unrelated. But I do feel like those books set end to end are kind of my memoir from that
Mm.
first 10 years. Like they were the things that I was struggling with at the time or the questions that I was like asking myself at the time. Not that I'm done asking questions or done, but I'm done writing that way. And so, now the legal series is like a totally and new direction for me. And I also just handed in a book with a co-author. So Lawyer Interrupted came out in 2015. And around that time, there was also this wonderful writer, Liz Brown, who had been a law partner. She's a Harvard law grad who was a law partner who left to be a law professor. And she had written a book called Life After Law. And she and I would kind of be in the same circuit. We'd end up at conferences together.
Mhm.
People would be talking to us about we were still kind of like unicorns, like you left the law, like you're
Right. Yeah,
yeah,
you're glad you did that?
personally be kind of like circling each other. So we decided a couple of years ago, our books are kind of dated now. We should, write. I kept kind of pitching like a volume 2, but then I was like, I think we need to just write a new book. And she was like, do you want to write it together? So
Awesome.
we pitched a book called How to Leave the Law. And we sold that literally on the eve of the pandemic. So we sold
Oh,
that
wow.
in February 2020. And then, it kind of became a little bit different, a different book. So we just handed that book in. That's coming out in the fall of this year, later this year. So after spending a long time trying to get away from the law, I'm now doing nothing but
Law.
talking to lawyers, which has got its own kind of, bittersweet feelings associated with it. But yeah.
But yeah, that means those 15 years were just really amazing research. You were like
Oh,
embedded. You were embedded
Yeah,
research.
it's just there's some richness to draw from. It's amazing.
Yeah, I have so many stories. That's what I just was writing the acknowledgments for in her defense, and I do have to thank and I did thank my legal mentors and colleagues for the stories. And they'll never recognize themselves.
Oh gosh. Oh, and we're already kind of running over time, but I also
We're
want to hear
definitely
about your
working.
podcast,
Oh
which is a
yeah.
topic
Well,
near and dear to our heart.
Yes,
yeah,
I've been really enjoying it. You're in season 2?
I am in season 2. Thank you so
That's
much.
great.
And yeah, the funny thing about the podcast is, like I said, I was writing this book during COVID about, a lawyer turned podcast host. I just thought that was such a sexy, interesting thing, right? But
It's so sexy. I mean, we really learned how sexy.
yeah, but so what happened was I released this book, I Know How This Ends, which was the follow-up to my debut novel, 4 novels
Yeah.
later. And, it released. So sign a book contract on the eve of the pandemic, and then my book released March 3rd, 2020. So, like, literally on the eve of the pandemic, my whole book tour got canceled, and
Mm.
I spent I did, like, a pre-launch event in the Hamptons the last week of February. I can remember that everyone was talking about, like, "Should we cancel our flights?" I'm like, "Cancel your flight? Why would you cancel your flight?
It's so
It's
crazy.
cold. It's fine. Everyone's fine. Cold. It's gonna be over next it'll be fine." So, lo and behold, my last book event was the last week of February in the Hamptons,
Oh.
2020, and then the next week my book comes out, and I have no book tour, and I have no way of promoting my book, and such a small problem in the scheme of what was going on in the world.
Well, yeah.
But we're also in lockdown, and writing is such a solitary thing. And all my writer friends and a lot of writer friends who had books coming out around the same time, everybody was just kind of like, it was just a whole added layer of depression to the time.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so a lot of us started trying to promote each other in different ways. Like, hey, you want to do a Facebook Live or you want to do this? And I started a book club. My book was called I Know How This Ends. I started a book club called I Know How This Book Ends. And I just basically got my stack of reading that I was holed up in my, bedroom reading because I everything else had been canceled. And I just basically invited my friends who had new releases out, like, "Hey, do you wanna come on a book club?" And so we did this virtual book club, and it started to get some press, and then it was in Book Trip as, like, a big virtual event from 2020. And so then in 2021, this basically a startup company that is, Speak.Studio, which is, creating podcasts, a podcast app and got some interesting kind of, like, podcast software, asked me to turn the book club into a podcast. And then I was like, okay, I really did manifest this fun thing.
Yes.
So yeah, so what started as the I Know How This Book Ends book club in during the pandemic has now become I Know How This Book Ends podcast. And I interview authors who have new releases coming out. We usually try to do the interview. I get all these. The best perk of the job is I get all these advanced copies of books, and then we have try to time the interview to the episode to release as close to the pub day as we can. But really, what it's about is I interview them as a writer, right? So I know exactly what they're telling everyone else and every other book club and every other group they're doing. They're being asked the same questions. I know the questions, been asked them all, right? But I also know what nobody's asking them. And
Yes.
Yeah.
so,
That's what I love about it.
yeah, so, like, my favorite moment is inevitably when they say, nobody's asked me that." I'm like, "Alright." And, who are you afraid to read the book? Who is this character really about? With the real, like, nuggets of story behind the story. So,
Yes.
we have fun. We, try to be spontaneous about the discussion. But I always say, like, when you write, you understand that authors aren't writing autobiographical novels,
Right.
but they're very personal, right? So there's a
Right.
lot of, like, you in your story.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, so that's what we're trying to get to.
I love it. Did starting a podcast change anything about that you had written about your character? Like, did it change some of the
Oh,
podcasting info, like, or inform
interesting.
it in any way?
Um, it didn't. It didn't. It's a very different podcast that she got. So no, so it didn't change anything. Maybe it's changed a little bit about how I handle the podcast, though. I don't
Yeah.
know.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
No, it's really good. We'll put it in the show notes, and
Thank you.
especially if you write.
Yeah.
But even if you don't write, if you just love to read, like,
Yeah.
it's super interesting.
Yeah, and the other thing is I always say, I always ask every author, because it's called I Know How This Book Ends. We always talk spoiler free about how the book ends because I read all
Yeah.
of them.
That's
I
a
don't
delicate balance you've got there.
So we'll just talk in a general way, like, was this really how you wanted the book to end? And what you might be surprised to hear from a lot of these authors is no. The answer is no, right? So
Mhm.
they've had to change the ending for an editor. They had to change an ending because the first one didn't work. Or it's just as they started out writing, they had a certain idea of how the book was going to end and then it changed. So that is always very intriguing to me about how the stories change as you're writing it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm writing my first novel
I love
and I've
that.
written a really rough draft and I'm reworking it. The story changes and
It
sometimes the story
changes.
needs to change and like that aha moment of this
Yeah.
is what's not working.
Yeah.
And I have a funny feeling if it ever sees the light of day, what will see the light of day is not at all what I started with.
Right. Right.
Just you just got to enjoy that ride.
Yeah. And I always tell people you never have as much time as you do to write your first book. So enjoy it, even though it feels laborious. Also enjoy it because you really do have time to like really like work through all those things. And after that, you never have that much time to write a book again.
Because they want the next one.
They want
Yeah.
the next one. Exactly. Okay, well, tell people where to find you. Where's our best place for listeners to stay up with what you're releasing and what's going on in your world?
Yeah. So if you go to my website, which is my name, amyimpellizzeri.com, which sounds much worse than it is.
We'll have it in the show notes in case
Yeah.
anybody's
Yeah.
intimidated.
Subscribe to my newsletter. Totally. I don't spam. It's very spam free, but I always will make sure that you have information about the new podcast episodes and you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, anywhere you listen to your podcast, anywhere you listen to this podcast. And yeah, and so sign up for my newsletter. I'm very active on Instagram too, which is just my name again. And please keep in touch. I read reader emails. I love them as long as they're nice. No. Yeah. But so yeah, I definitely love to keep in touch with readers. So please do subscribe to the newsletter and keep in touch for sure.
Okay, well, we're going to put all that. We'll put it in the comments here and then we'll put it in the show notes too.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, this was fun. I could talk writing all day.
Oh my gosh.
It's excited that we're in touch now and looking forward to keeping in touch.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
This was so much fun. This is much more fun than the State of the Union address that we're about to all go watch. But
We got to do it.
I'll have to go refill this bad boy.
Smart.
Yeah. Thanks for being here with us and having a little fun first.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you to both of you.
Absolutely. All right. I'm going to end our live broadcast
All right.
now.
Bye,
everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Mom and podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's show. And if you know someone else who could benefit from the episode, please be sure and share it with them. And while we're begging, please subscribe and rate us wherever it is you listen to podcasts. You can find links to all the things we discussed today in our show notes or over at our website, momandpodcast.com, with the A-N-D spelled out. In between shows, find us over at the socials, including our private Mom and Community Facebook group. The links to that group and all of our socials can be found at momandpodcast.com. Thank you so much for your support. We appreciate you more than you know. Now go out there and make your ellipses count.